It's May 18th, 1897, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ollie, the Retrospectors.
So today was the day of the premiere of Bram Stoker's Dracula. That's right, I said premiere, not publication. The book was published 8 days later on the 26th of May, 1897, but on the 18th of May, specifically the morning of the 18th of May, 1897, Bram Stoker put on what by all accounts was a dreadful, tedious and very long production of his stage adaptation of his own novel that no one had read yet at the Lyceum Theatre in London. Quite a big space to put this on.
But he was able to pull a few strings there, I think we can assume, because he was the business manager of the Lyceum Theatre at the time. Not many people have the opportunity to put on a kind of improvised show of their novel.
Yeah.
And yet only 2 people came. It wasn't the premiere that he might have hoped for, except for the fact that it was exactly the premiere he hoped for.
Yes, because the whole thing was essentially like a legal technicality, and a really clever one when you look back on it. So what it was is to copyright the characters that he'd created in the book Dracula, and it's kind of amazing, really, to think that he did invent those characters, but he did. Count Dracula did not exist in popular myth before Bram Stoker wrote him, and he got the name Dracula out of a very dry book written by an ex-civil servant about Wallachia and Moldavia in a museum library, and he knew that he should protect it, and because he worked at the Lyceum Theatre, he knew that if you submitted a play to be performed back in those days, it had to be approved by the Lord Chamberlain's office, because things had to be censored. And so he knew that if he submitted the play script to the Lord Chamberlain's office, then he was effectively ensuring he would retain copyright on the characters, for dramatic use anyway, because there's a rubber stamp saying we've read this on this date, and you were the first person to submit it to us.
And accordingly, I do feel really sorry for those 2 people who stumbled in off the street expecting something. I don't know what they were expecting, but what they got apparently was a prologue and 5 acts with 40 scenes in total that would have run for apparently about 6 hours. And at the end of the play, according to the sort of the remnant notes that we still have of the first run, it just gets increasingly just pages that were torn out of the manuscript of the book and stuck into this thing. So by the end, the actors are really just reading the book in advance of its release.
The tragedy of it really is that he was right. Real success of the characters would be in dramatic form, but it didn't really happen until movies. There have been over 200 films of Dracula, but they were all made after he died.
That's right, but they did actually get based on a play. It was eventually turned into a play, which happened in the early 1920s, and a young actor who was called Hamilton Dean joined the Lyceum Theatre and made that connection with Stoker while he was still alive, but then didn't go on to come up with this play until after Stoker's death, at which point he got the rights from Stoker's widow Florence, who herself was by then embroiled in this legal dispute with the makers of Nosferatu, which was, as it turns out, this knockoff version of Dracula that was completely unauthorized.
Yeah, that's what Nosferatu really means in Romanian, knockoff.
Well, it is weird, isn't it? Because when you watch Nosferatu, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but you think, oh, it's Dracula.
The way that you describe that is like something you do habitually as well. You know, when of a Friday evening you put on Nosferatu.
I mean, I've seen it on several occasions. It had such an influence on kind of shaping that dramatic perception of Dracula, but they very lightly adjusted the details in a kind of half-assed attempt to avoid copyright infringement. Dracula is actually called Count Orlok in the intertitles, if you've seen them. They sort of change some vague names and they make it set in Germany, but obviously it's the exact same story, although it's the first depiction of Dracula being killed by sunlight, because in the novel it only hurt him.
Yeah, stake through the heart, isn't it, in the novel? Sorry, spoiler on a 120-year-old book.
Yeah, and so Florence Stoker did challenge it. I think she actually had some success at one point, and the filmmakers were ordered to stop distributing the film, but copies kept circulating, and it sounds like eventually she sort of just gave up trying to fight it.
The story is that it survives because the first 2 copies of the film had been sent and were on their way to the States. All of the copies that were in Europe were ordered to be destroyed, but the 2 that were en route to the US survived, and it has become subsequently the classic that we know of.
All of which is very interesting, but as I say, Stoker was dead. I mean, he died in 1912. He left behind £4,723. His obituaries didn't even mention Dracula, which is astonishing, isn't it? It's word association now. If you say Bram Stoker, you think Dracula.
Presumably they described him more as the business manager of the Lyceum because he did write a lot of other novels, but they were all shockingly, uniformly quite bad. No one ever said, oh, this is almost as good as Dracula. They were all several levels below Dracula.
Well, one of his most popular was 2 volumes about working with Henry Irving, who was a really famous actor at the time, who was the actor-manager of the Lyceum Theatre.
Yeah, and allegedly who Bram Stoker based Dracula's mannerisms on. And that was intended as a compliment because obviously if you overlook the vampire fact, Count Dracula is a perfect gentleman in the opening chapters, if you recall.
Yes, and Henry Irving had played Mephistopheles in Faust quite a lot. You can see the comparison there, can't you, between the Eastern European shady but kind of intriguing aristocratic man of letters and how he might have done Mephistopheles in the West End. So it must have really hurt Bram Stoker when he'd written this thing. He'd been Henry Irving's dog's body for like 30 years or something. And then he said, I'm doing a play reading upstairs. Do you want to come and do it? And he was like, no, mate, sorry, busy. I've got a show to do.
We look at Dracula now as being a horror novel, but at the time it was part of this wave of what was called invasion literature. It started off with this book called The Battle of Dorking, which was about an invasion of Britain by, I think it was by Prussia. So it started off as being anxieties around the empire and everything, and then it got into weird supernatural stuff like War of the Worlds was part of this wave. And so Dracula kind of fits neatly into that. Dracula's like this mysterious foreigner, and he ends up, coming to the UK on a boat. And in Nosferatu it's even more explicit. I mean, he literally like brings the plague with
Rebecca,
him.
have you ever written the York Notes on Dracula? I understand you studied it for A-level.
Yes, I did study it for A-level. So if you want any insights into some of the more evocative imagery,
Themes.
etc.
Yeah,
I can tell
language.
you about how the weather reflects what the characters are feeling.
Much like this one page of Much Ado About Nothing that I happen to have also read.
I think we'd get a really good insight into 18-year-old Rebecca as well.
Oh, it was so bad. At one point, we were allowed to write our own piece of coursework based on something to do with Hamlet, and I wrote an essay comparing it to Taxi Driver. And in retrospect, I was like such a fucking wannabe cool tryhard.
Have you read Dracula, Arian?
No, I haven't. I started reading it when we decided on doing this podcast, but I didn't get very far.
Okay, so me too. I've never read Dracula.
Guys, where did you go to school?
Yes, we do research, Rebecca. Yeah, I believe. I was completely captivated in a way that I really wasn't expecting. Rebecca, this is old news to you, obviously.
Come on.
You can put that blue highlighter away. I didn't realise that the whole thing is essentially like the Blair Witch Project found footage, isn't it? That's how it's constructed, but like 100 years before. The whole thing's journal entries and diaries and found letters.
And Stoker wanted it to say right up front, this is a true story. Everything that you read in this is true. And his editor was like, nope, and took it all out. So he really did intend it to read that way.
But that's so clever, isn't it? If you're a bit of a so-so writer, which I think we can all agree he is, that's such a clever way to structure a novel, isn't it? Because for a start, you don't have to write much dialogue because it's all someone's memory of what happened. And secondly, you just jump to the good bit. Just cut out the crap, don't you? Which
Yeah,
is
but
incredible.
the only thing with those is when you read novels like that, you get to that part at the end of the chapter where it says, I came across an old book and opened it. And you're like, oh no, the next chapter's just going to be them doing like a fake chapter from an old book.
And actually, the fact that Bram Stoker was a civil servant for all those years before he was a theatre manager, I think, again, he brilliantly incorporates because there's some pretty boring detail that the character Jonathan writes in his diary that makes it feel authentic. Like he's exploring Eastern Europe and he talks about like the paprika they put in their chicken and ordnance survey maps. And you're like, yes, that's exactly what a boring person would write.
So in terms of where Stoker got his inspiration for Dracula, there's a lot of speculation that he might have seen reports of an incident that happened 5 years earlier in Rhode Island in which a young girl was exhumed. She had died of TB and her family had died of TB and her brother was ill with TB. And so the villagers dug all the bodies up and noticed that she still had some blood in her heart. So they burned her heart and liver and used the ashes to make a tonic to feed to her brother, who unsurprisingly died.
Why would that be your first thought?
This was part of a wider New England vampire folklore that had been going on at that point for well over 100 years. In Manchester, Vermont in 1793, the local town history describes a heart-burning ceremony thusly. Timothy Mead officiated at the altar in the sacrifice to the demon vampire, who it was believed was still sucking the blood of the then living wife of Captain Burton. It was the month of February and good slaying.
Oh, good. Well, so long as it was temperate.
Tomorrow.
the archetypes, they're still there. You know, the football jock who secretly loves to sing, the shy girl who has a great voice.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts,
Part of the Acast Creator Network.